Welcome everyone to this final session of the Water, Wash and Climate Symposium. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Yuggarabil, Yugara, Yagara and Turrbal peoples who are the traditional owners of the land that I'm joining you from today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. My name is Regina Suter from the International Water Centre at Griffith University, and we are really pleased to be hosting this symposium in partnership with the Australian Government Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the Water for Women Fund and the Asian Development Bank. Now let's get underway with this last session. I'm really pleased to introduce the facilitator for this panel, Richard Damania. For this panel discussion on a topic I think is really critical, and that is collaboration beyond the water sector for multiple development benefits, including water security. Richard is Chief Economist of the Sustainable Development Practice Group at the World Bank. Prior to this position, he was Senior Advisor to the World Bank's Global Water Practice, and he has served as the lead economist for South Asia, Africa, and Latin American regional units within the World Bank. Before joining the World Bank, Richard was an academic at the University of Adelaide here in Australia in the School of Economics. He has over 100 publications in academic journals. Welcome, Richard, and we are really very grateful that you are facilitating this discussion today with what I know is a really excellent panel lineup. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Regina. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us from. It is really genuinely a great pleasure to be here and to be able to host this session with our really distinguished panelists. But before we kick off, there's just a few things I really want to say about what this session is about and why this session. We know when we talk about water, water is the quintessential connector in nature. None of us can live without water. So we know that we all need water, and water connects us. What we also know, we may or may not realize it, that all the water that we have on Earth today has always been on Earth, every single molecule. Therefore, that water has been recycled and recycled again and again. And if we are not mindful of how we use that water and how that water connects us all, we end up wasting it and sometimes destroying it. So that connection becomes absolutely critical, and especially in a time of climate change. And what this closing session is really about is recognizing and understanding those linkages and learning from people who've been working with those linkages. So without further ado, I'd like to kick this session off with a very short video that we have from Barwon Water, which is a water utility that I'd suggest to you is unlike many a water utility that works rather seriously about connecting the drops right across the region where Barwon Water works. So over to the video, enjoy.
I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land that I come from today, the Wadawurrung, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal people who may be joining us today. I'd like to start also by explaining a little bit about Barwon Water. So Barwon Water is Victoria's largest urban region water corporation. We operate over an area of about 8,000 square kilometres, including Victoria's second largest city, Geelong, but many other towns and smaller cities in our region. Our region includes places like the Great Ocean Road and the Surf Coast, and we are wholly owned by the Victorian Government, and we operate both as a wholesaler and a retailer. So what I mean by that is that we source our own water, we distribute that, and then we on-sell that to customers, retailers, industry, business and residential customers, and a small number of agricultural customers as well in our region. In addition to our water services, we are also the sewerage waste treatment provider for our region. So obviously that's residential sewage waste treatment, but also industrial and trade waste treatment. In 2017, Bowen Water developed our Strategy 2030, which has a number of ambitious goals for what we want to achieve for our region, and particularly addressing challenges of population growth, climate change, and changes in industry and technology in our region. Now, some of the goals related to today's topic are really important. First of all, we have committed to being zero emissions by 2030, 100% renewable energy by 2025, to become a climate resilient provider of water, to reduce our environmental impact, particularly on rivers, to manage our assets in a way that reduces their energy consumption, their energy in design, their carbon in design through all life stages of the business case and implementation, and for our assets to be more resilient to drought, flood, and coastal erosion and other impacts of climate change. And finally, a really important goal for us is to keep our prices affordable for all of our customers. One of the other goals of our Strategy 2030 is to work in partnerships in a strategic way. Now, partnerships is a word that can be interpreted in a number of different ways, but for us it was really about recognising that while we can achieve the goals of our strategy on our own, we know we'll get better outcomes when we partner with others. And in particular, that's how we believe that we have been able to implement significant emissions reduction and renewable energy without increasing costs. And in fact, in some cases, getting a return on investment that's some non-regulated income for us. So it has become a really critical aspect of the way that we are delivering this change. I'll just give a couple of examples. We worked with our two large food manufacturing businesses in one of our small cities called Colac. And those two businesses are our trade waste customers, so they have been customers of Bowen Water for many years. And I approached them and asked them about the challenges that we were facing. So not necessarily water challenges, just challenges for their business. And one of the key challenges that they identified was rising and uncertain energy costs, both in gas and electricity. And at the time we were trialling a way of capturing methane at our sewage treatment plant, and we were really looking at that and thinking it wasn't really viable. So I asked the team to think about, well, what if we thought differently about the trade waste with these two businesses, and whether or not that would make this system more viable. Now, lots of exploration, lots of discussions, lots of negotiations later, we now have long-term waste supply agreements with those two customers. We've turned the trade waste model on its head. They are now, instead of paying to treat their waste before they discharge it to sewerage, they are now discharging high-strength organic waste. We are capturing that under a cover, running that methane through a cogen engine and generating renewable electricity from it. And in the next stage of it, we'll be returning hot water back to one of those manufacturers, which they will use to replace the need to heat their water through gas. Now, all three parties, Bowen Water, Buller Cream and the Australian Lamb Company, we have entered into commercial agreements. So this is where the partnership isn't just some soft, friendly thing, although it has been a very positive and constructive process. But they are commercial agreements where all three parties are better off. In the case of Buller and Australian Lamb Company, through reduced costs and eventually through offsets of those of uses of gas. And from our point of view, we're generating renewable energy. It has taken the entire Colac wastewater treatment plant, a high energy user, a high emitter, completely off the grid. We are now running that through our own renewable dispatchable energy from this process. And of course, those waste supply agreements for over a 10-year period mean that we've got certainty to pay off the asset over time. So it's a really good example. It's taken a long time. It took a lot of attempts before we landed the combination of factors that meant that it was actually a positive for all three parties. I'll talk about a second example, and this is on a whole of region basis. We are aware that our local governments, the 5 councils in our region, will be required to collect organic waste from the curbside of people's homes in coming years. And there is no facility in our region to turn that organic material into a beneficial product. And so we explored with them the idea of, again, turning that organic material into beneficial products for our region in our region. And that project is now underway and being implemented. And what it will do is produce both renewable energy to help, again, offset the energy use of our Black Rock treatment plant, our largest treatment plant, sewage treatment plant in the region. I want to emphasise that undertaking these kinds of projects is not easy. It requires a lot of persistence and quite a lot of work thinking through the commercial arrangements. Most people would think the technology is the hardest part. The technology is, of course, challenging, and it's emerging and it's changing, and you've got to choose the right technology. But I would argue it's not in the hardest part. In terms of working in partnerships, the first and most important ingredient is trust. We have been able to work in both of these partnerships with our partners because we are a trusted organisation. We have a track record of being transparent. We operate in the interests of our region and our customers, and I think that's a really important foundational ingredient. The commercial frameworks, absolutely critical to work those through in a way that is transparent with each of the parties, but which respects the confidentiality of that information with other parties around the table, and which is fair and ensures everyone is better off overall and over time. So we've got these 10-year waste supply agreements, and we've got a number of checkpoints in them to make sure that within a given parameters we're all still better off over time. It's important also to assess the alignment of the drivers of the different partners. If those drivers are not in alignment, then you're not going to be able to work through the time and challenges and complexity of the agreement. So I think that's a really important thing to work out up front. And then, of course, as a company delivering a service to our customer base, finally, I guess, working through how to organise the technology and the commercial arrangements in a way that isn't needing to be subsidised by other customer groups that aren't directly benefiting from it, and in fact in ways that might actually help to keep a lid on prices and keep costs down. They're really some of the ingredients or challenges to work through, but the benefits are absolutely amazing. Like, to feel like you're contributing to challenges that are global in nature in our own backyard, and doing that in a way that's benefiting business, agriculture, and our community in general, and in a way that leverages and builds on the strengths of our own organisation, both its assets and its capabilities and its goals. It's just a fantastic experience, and one that gives our organisation a real sense of achievement and contribution.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed that short little video. not an ordinary utility, one that extends far beyond the mandate of what we would expect of a water utility, going into waste management and everything else. And we're going to deepen some of the things that we heard about. And we have three extremely distinguished and well-qualified panelists to really talk about the connections that one can make through water and why we actually need to do it from the WASH sector. To kick us off, we're going to have Dr. Tristan Armstrong, who is a Senior Agricultural Development and Food Sector Specialist at Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. He comes with immense experience. He has, in fact, over 25 years of professional experience in agricultural research, rural development, and natural resource management. Tristan has designed and implemented a wide range of projects across a large number of countries, Asia, the Pacific, and indeed sub-Saharan Africa too. Before joining DFAT, Tristan was a research scientist at none less than ANU, that's Australia's National University, CSIRO, which is a premier research institution of Australia, and the Landcare Research New Zealand. He was also a country director for WWF International in the Solomon Islands. Welcome, Tristan. Our next speaker is also very, very well qualified. Christina Leal-Nagele is the Manager for Sustainable Tourism Development with the South Pacific Tourism Organization. She works regionally, but has a particular focus on global sustainable tourism agenda and also together with the SPTO member countries. Christina is Samoan and began her career with the National Tourism Office of Samoa. Welcome, Christina. And last but not least, we have Emma O'Neill. Emma is Manager of Environment and Planning at Oricon. She's a freelance communications and sustainability strategist and subcontracts on international projects, including WASH and land planning. Emma comes with a wealth of experience, wears a wide range of hats too, especially in the water sector. Her expertise as a planner gives her a broad perspective, especially when it comes to observing trends and bringing together diverse sectors. So we're going to hear a lot from Emma about how to bring seemingly very, very different sectors and people together. So I'd like to start by giving a question to each one of our panelists, and perhaps starting with Tristan. So Tristan, like we saw in the Barwon Water video, your work connects WASH to agriculture and food security. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Thanks, Richard, and hi everyone on the line. I hope you can hear me loud and clear. Look, it's a great pleasure to have been invited to contribute to this symposium. I think this is an absolutely fascinating and really dynamic field as we certainly in the aid space seek to deliver more effective programs around the Indo-Pacific region. What we are really experiencing is just a massive increase in awareness and also demand for programs that, for agricultural and food security programs that directly address water and WASH as part of their design and implementation. And I think we're seeing that because climate change is really accelerating many of the challenges that agriculture is facing, and we as a global community have to, and indeed are, succeeding in small part to really improve the way in which we bring those sectors together to deliver better outcomes in terms of food security, in terms of nutrition, in terms of water management, and kind of social organisation. So I think I might just provide a little bit of a taste of some of the work that we do in this space. And I'll talk briefly about three quite different programs in different places, but they all have a lot of differences, but also some fundamental kind of themes that link them. And I'll quickly get into that. So I might start with in some ways quite a simple but very challenging one. We're currently working across a number of atoll states in the Pacific, and these atoll states, for those of you who know the Pacific, they're very low lying. Many of them, Kiribati, Tuvalu, are at most a few meters above sea level. They are completely reliant on basically rain for their water supply, and freshwater lenses that exist in the soil between basically that sit above the saltwater table. What we're seeing in the Pacific and indeed around the world is that sea levels are rising. And those, in our region, sea levels, particularly the Pacific, are rising faster than in many parts of the world. Storm surges are getting more intense. And that, alongside increase in population density and, in some cases, past poor use of those very, very finite freshwater resources, is leading to critical constraints on not only water availability, but soil itself. So we've got situations where quite large populations are reliant on really very small areas of agricultural land to produce all of their fresh fruit and vegetables. And once soils become too saline, crops won't grow. So we're looking at essentially, in some cases, the end of agriculture that has existed there for thousands of years. And what we're trying to do with these communities and try to empower them to basically retain agricultural activity using different innovative technologies, including raised garden beds and keyhole gardens that actually lift the fresh water above the soil that's now too saline to use, and provide a system that basically enables much more efficient use of water, use of very, very finite water resources, some of which are being derived from solar-powered and also diesel-powered reverse osmosis desalination plants, particularly at the moment in the Central Pacific, which is experiencing a very, very intense drought associated with the La Nina event. So that's really for some of the island councils and the individual households that we're working with across the Pacific. This has really been transformational and has allowed them to once again produce taro, produce moringa, and kumara, and a whole lot of other crops that are really important for them culturally, and are also really important source of food nutrients and health in places that have become increasingly reliant on imported food. And of course, that is often highly processed, and it's leading to a range of really complicated health and non-communicable disease issues in the Pacific. So this program has water is really at the center of this program. Managing water in a changed environment is really at the core of it. And through doing that effectively, we're able to produce better food security outcomes, better nutritional outcomes, and better social outcomes. The second program I'd like to briefly touch on is in the Mekong Delta. It's actually been more broad than that in Vietnam, and that comes out of a really innovative multilateral investment that we've been part of for the last few years called AgResults. And what we've been doing, for those of you who know Vietnam rice production is very reliant on water from the Mekong Delta, from the Mekong River. The Mekong River at the moment is facing a range of really extreme threats, not just because of climate change, but also because of upriver water extraction and dam construction. So Vietnam's had a number of seasons where the amount of fresh water running down that river has really been insufficient to grow the annual rice crop. And it's, the Mekong Delta is the breadbasket of the region, but it's also one of the main sources of exported rice around the world, and particularly in the Pacific and Asia. So we're talking about impacts, that have the potential to touch, hundreds of millions of people related to rice production in this region. The Vietnamese government is also very forward-thinking, very aware of climate, and very keen to ensure that it can reduce its emissions in line with its nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. Rice production is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions, methane and nitrous oxide being the two most notable ones. And essentially, we know from research and from a number of publicly funded initiatives that exist and continue to exist, that you can really substantially reduce your greenhouse gas emissions in rice by better water management, and specifically alternate wet and dry management. Alongside that, you can change your fertilizer regime management. You can change the varieties of rice that you plant and how you plant them, and manage them, and manage the organic residues of those rice after you finish the harvest, to dramatically reduce your greenhouse gas emissions whilst improving your yields. Now, we'd assessed a whole range of different publicly funded extension programs that were seeking to work with farmers and had successfully done so at a small scale. But the Vietnamese government was really interested in looking at how can you align incentives, as our previous speaker mentioned, and I think that really struck a chord with me. You know, in order to scale out, you've got to be able to develop a system which has internally embedded incentives for particular, for essentially all major players within that system. And so we decided to work through the private sector, who are already across the landscape, working with both farming communes and individual smallholder farmers in the rice value chain. And using a price challenge approach, we incentivize those value chain providers to not only come up with packages that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase yields and incomes, test those and ensure that they were robust, and then actually scale them out to tens of thousands of smallholder farmers across hundreds of thousands of hectares. And this, it generated a whole lot of interest. It generated a whole lot of investment from the private sector. It generated a whole lot of awareness amongst smallholder farmers about the potentials that were the potential of increased income and reduced labour costs, reduced input costs, and we had this, really interesting experiment of essentially using a financial carrot with no preconditions about how initially about how the private sector would achieve the results. And it ended up being very, very successful. And again, it was about aligning incentives and ensuring that that essentially government acted as a catalyzer rather than a doer. And so we're looking now at scaling that out in 3 new provinces in the Mekong Delta over the next few years. The third, again, very fundamentally about water and looking at a large public tertiary irrigation scheme, or various tertiary irrigation schemes in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in southeastern Africa. We've been working with some scientists at CSIRO and ANU, alongside the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, to roll out technologies that empower smallholder farmers that access water from these large publicly funded utilities. And what we've been seeing in sub-Saharan Africa in this dryland system is that not only is water really critical and limited, we're also seeing very large increases in food demand and very large increases in population, and real constraints around the productivity of these systems. But alongside that, we're seeing the smallholder farmers themselves really disempowered within that system. Very little access to knowledge, very little access to the sorts of information to allow them to make better choices and to be more informed about how they use both water and nutrients. So with a very cheap and simple a bit of technology, essentially a water and nitrogen probe that sits in the soil and measures water potential at different depths and also nitrogen availability. And then it has a color-coded light, green, red, or yellow, to each of these smallholder farmers can then actually see how much water they've got in the soil and how much water they need. So it's actually enabling them to only use the water that they need and only apply fertilizer when they need it. And fertilizer is a really major cost, and it's the cost of fertilizer, including nitrogenous fertilizer, is through the roof at the moment because of the price of gas and also other supply constraints. So by doing this, we got some really interesting and unexpected results. Farmers not only used less water, like 2/3 less water, but the conflict amongst farmers was actually dramatically reduced because farmers downstream, who traditionally had not received their full allocations because of over-extraction upstream in the system, were finally able to actually fully utilise their allocations and fully utilise their farms. We saw dramatic decreases in the overuse of fertiliser and massive productivity and income increases. So just putting information and power in the hands of smallholders to make better decisions was really fundamental to how those people were able to interact with each other and also interact with a water system that they suddenly had much more control over. So I guess that some of the themes that link these three examples, and I mean, I could provide many more examples of the work that we're doing in this space that links food, water, and energy, is that, well, firstly, it's about incentivizing people down the value chain to ensure that people have there's a stimulus behind the intent of it. We're not simply just standing on high and preaching. We're actually providing people with real economic incentives through the system. But secondly, it's really about working with smallholders who are the vast majority of farmers around the world. They're often the poorest, but they produce most of the food that is eaten on the planet. And empowering them with new technologies, new approaches and new ideas that they own and that they value and that they derive benefit from. So yeah, like, I'm really excited about continuing to work in this space as climate change impacts exacerbate in our region. There's increasing demand from many of our partner governments and communities for help with improved management of food water systems. And obviously in places where there's processing or where there's the need for energy sources to drive these agricultural systems, energy comes into the mix. There obviously hydro is another matter, and we could get into that. But at a small scale, getting people off diesel, and also bringing in some of the renewables and into the system, as we are in Kiribati with the small scale solar reverse osmosis machines, which are actually feeding in and will be feeding into our raised garden beds, is just really exciting. So I'm happy to take questions, Richard.
Those are great examples. Thank you so much, Tristan. And extremely big problems, big issues. So much of the world grows and eats rice, and it's so polluting. And the problem of nitrogen and the overuse of nitrogen fertilizer pollutes water, creates dead zones, is terrible for human health. So these are wonderful to be able to scale them up. But we have to move on. We could be here all day talking about those really important things. I'd like to turn next to Christina. Christina, thank you so much for joining us. But we would really all like to hear from you. What is happening in the tourism sector in terms of making the connections with water? Can you take a few minutes to tell us about what you are working on in this space? Thank you. The floor is yours, Christina.
Tal of love, and thank you very much, Richard, for the opportunity, and thank you also for the invitation for SBTO to be represented here. I'm Christina, and I'm part of the Sustainable Tourism Program at the Pacific Tourism Organization. We're based in Suva, Fiji. We have 20 Pacific Island member countries, and our mandate is to support our members in the areas of marketing the region, but also development through sustainable tourism planning and development, as well as research and statistics. Now, in relation to the question, there's been a lot of work that has been done in the sector in terms of looking at how we, first of all, access water for the provision of tourism services, especially for those rural tourism operations. Collaboration between, of course, government as the main supplier of water and the private sector in terms of businesses, but also those communities who have independent water services or schemes that are being provided to wherever tourism operations are. Now, in our mandate, we do not do a lot of work on the ground. That's our member countries through the ministries of tourism. But I would say in the role of SBTO as a regional intergovernmental organization, we provide policy advice and support to our national tourism organizations. And some of this work really aligns well with the theme of the discussions, and very grateful that tourism had to be considered in the program, because we don't get the opportunity a lot to be involved in the discussions. I think this is the first one where we've talked about tourism and water, which is so important, and thank you very much. But in terms of the policy level work that we do, in the last 2 years, we've been working hard with our government and private sector, as well as civil society organizations, in putting together a sustainable tourism policy framework, which was based on a call from our Pacific Island member countries to see a strategic direction where we could all move forward together in terms of making tourism sustainable for our Pacific Island countries. This is also aligned to the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, but also more importantly to the national priorities of our own individual countries. So that framework was endorsed by our ministers last year in October, and really it brings together the vision of our tourism sector, which comprises of so many stakeholders, including visitors, but also most importantly, our communities or villages who are providing the support for tourism to take effect in all our member countries, highlighting what is very important for us to work towards. And one of that definitely is increasing opportunities in terms of economic prosperity for our communities and people, but also at the same time look at the importance of including our people in the planning of tourism, our communities, to see that they are thriving and being very meaningfully engaged in the work that tourism does. The other goal that we're working towards is making sure that tourism can amplify our voices in terms of sharing our culture and heritage with the rest of the world. And then last and most importantly is making sure that we keep tab on the importance of healthy islands and oceans, actions on climate resilience, but also making sure that tourism in the long term becomes a resource efficient sector. And that's where we see the strong linkages with our natural resources and how we manage them. Tourism depends on very much everything that nature provides. And so water is at the center of everything. And I think we are a resource intensive sector. We use a lot of water. The challenge is we don't know how much we are using. And so that data is missing, and we cannot inform our actions and policies if there's no evidence to support our claims that, we need to take action. And sometimes data is always required for actions to be effective. The other, and linked to that is the other work that we are now embarking on, which is really to set up indicators of, success. What does it really mean for tourism to be successful and to be sustainable? Sustainability is such a big term, and it means different things to different people. And so as a sector, we need to be very serious about what we're talking about here. Really, if we ask the question, okay, does Fiji's tourism industry use water and how much? I don't think we have that data. We don't have that data. And it's very, very crucial for us to be knowing our impact, our footprint on the environment, so that we can do something. And we don't have to wait for the data, but unfortunately, it's at the basis of, accessing funding and planning interventions. So we're working on a sustainability indicators framework where we could come together as a region and identify, okay, what are those measures that we need to put in place? What do our countries need in terms of getting that data and accessing that data? And I do understand that here we have a lot of water experts. I'm looking forward to hearing discussions around how can we access, data at a national level if industry level data is not possible to be accessed. And how can we start those conversations? Because it takes, data is something else, there's a lot of challenges when it comes to data too, in terms of sharing and all of that. But we recognize the importance of working together And one last initiative that I wanted to highlight is the commitment from our leaders. We have 8 of our member countries sign up to our Pacific Sustainable Tourism Commitment, which is basically our ministers of tourism at the very top of the structure of our development agenda, committing to sustainable tourism and elevating the importance of making tourism sustainable now and into the future. So we will advocate for better management of our water resources, and that's a platform where we can, push the message and hopefully inspire collaboration across sectors. So thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you so much, Christina. That was absolutely fascinating, the pragmatic approach that you have, and especially ending the idea about data. And we're going to hear a little bit more about data. We have a surprise speaker who's joining us, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who we didn't start off by introducing, and he's Mr. Saurabh Kumar. And he was the managing director of a very large company in India called the Energy Efficiency Services Limited Company. And it is one of India's largest super energy service companies. And this company works with consumers, industries, and governments to effectively bring down the amount of energy that's used. Mr. Kumar is an electric engineer by training, but he has a master's degree in public policy. And he's devoted much of his career to environmentalism, working for the UN and other excellent organizations such as that. Saurabh, about 5 minutes, and we would like to hear from you, if you don't mind, what your energy company that you led was doing, how it was instrumental in persuading water utilities and also farmers to take these issues seriously and in the realm of water. Could you give us a brief outline of how you made it work and what happened and what were the achievements?
Thank you, Richard. Let me first apologize for joining in a bit late because I was stuck in something which was beyond my control. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a very distinguished panel and it's a great pleasure to be here. The company that I was working with till about 8 or 9 months ago is a public sector government-owned company exclusively mandated to scale up energy efficiency in all sectors. And we started off with the lighting program, which became one of the world's biggest lighting programs, that had no subsidy either from the government or from anybody else. And then we also focused on municipal bodies from 2 standpoints. One, of course, is lighting, public lighting, which is the street lights. And the second, which is a very important pillar, which Richard, you just mentioned, is energy used for water and sewage pumping. Now, in India, that accounts for about 4% of the total energy that is used in the country, which is quite massive. And most of these utilities, water utilities, they are in a very poor financial health. As a result of it, the quality of service that they are providing to the consumers is also very bad. They have been using very old pumps and other equipment. As a result, the losses and the water losses are also substantially high. So we started to work when we showed success in the public lighting space, where our model was that we will come and invest in your upgrading your lights, and we will give you lighting as a service, which means that the municipal body doesn't have to do anything. For 7 years, we will maintain your lights, make sure that the uptime of lights is beyond 95%, and you pay us back from the saving that you have of energy. Similar model we proposed for the water pumping utilities. We did energy audits for almost about 500 cities in the country, and the results were outstanding. Depending upon the kind of pumping systems and the aging of those pumping systems that we found, there were opportunities of reducing cost, so energy cost, by as much as 40%, between 20 and 40%. So this was a program that was done in 2018-19. India being a very large country, a very diverse country, some utilities took it up, Some of them used our financing, some of them used their own financing to change. And this is an ongoing process, which is hopefully will be completed in the next few years. Now, as far as the agriculture is concerned, Richard, since you asked me, agriculture is a very different kettle of fish. In India, almost the entire agriculture energy consumption is subsidized by the government. So the farmers actually don't pay for electricity. As a result, there is no incentive of any farmer to either go in for energy efficiency or go in for water conservation, because it doesn't really matter. So we then looked around and said, what is it that we can do? How can we build incentives, and where are the incentives where we can align with? And then we tapped on to the provincial government, the state government, because it is the state government that provides subsidy in lieu of zero tariffs or low tariffs. So we said, if we replace the pumps with efficient pumps, your subsidy bill will go down by 30%. And therefore, why don't you do the financing? And that's how we succeeded in taking up the roles. It is not easy, honestly speaking. The farmers are resistant to change. And later on, during the question answer, I'll also try and explain something which is work in progress, where we try to, within this constraint system, we are trying to build in some incentives where the farmer can actually also look at not just energy conservation, but also water conservation. So with these words, let me hand it back to Richard, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. We'll come back to you. But of course, Sarah, what you said resonates very well with what we heard earlier from Tristan. The magic word seems to be incentives, right? If you have the incentives right, the farmers will join, the utilities will join. So perhaps we will come back to that issue later on the next round of questioning. But we need to move on. And Emma, can we turn to you next? So Emma, you're a planner, and you see connections where us other mortals don't. It's your job to sort of bring people, diverse groups together, and to have them connect and working for a common cause. Could you please share your thoughts and experiences as a planner with a water focus, how you have tried to bridge those gaps, and perhaps give us some examples of how you've done it? Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you to my fellow panelists for your wonderful contributions so far. So I am primarily an environmental planner, and I have experience also in land use planning. And planning really is primarily concerned with making good decisions about the allocation and use of land and resources in a way that benefits the community as a whole. So I've spent my career working in and with the water sector on a range of different challenges that start to bring things together. So this has included things like how to allocate water for high value irrigation while also protecting the ecological and cultural values of a water source, managing the impacts of land development on local waterways and sensitive wetland areas, making sure that local knowledge about land tenure is informing the need for and location of water infrastructure, and deciding how to adapt water supplies to a changing climate. And in my experience, the most challenging and also professionally interesting projects are those where there are multiple stakeholders involved who all have different perspectives that need to be appreciated and listened to. And as a planner, understanding and providing for these multiple stakeholder viewpoints in a sensitive and pragmatic way is really essential. So for example, when I was working in Kiribati, Pacific Island country, with the Ministry for Environment, Land and Agricultural Development, one of the challenges we found was that international consultants would not always be aware of the land tenure issues and the complex system of land ownership, government leases and private subleases that covered much of the very limited land in South Tarawa and Kiribati. And effective siting of infrastructure really required an understanding of and approval from many different people. So as a result, my colleagues and I, we really worked to build effective relationships to make sure that we could contribute that local knowledge of land planning requirements into infrastructure design decisions by establishing good relationship and engagement with donors and development partners. In another situation, also in Kiribati, there was a sanitation project where the Red Cross was working with unsewered communities to provide toilet facilities. And this provided a really good opportunity for my planning colleagues and I to help identify, streamline, and communicate the planning process to help make sure that WASH actors and others could better understand and engage in the right processes by making sure the information was available to them and so they could understand the planning application process. So in both cases there, the improvements happened in process and ultimately decision making because relationships across sectors were fostered and people on both sides of decision making were able to feel comfortable working together and understanding each other's objectives. In another example from some of my work in planning in New Zealand, I had an interesting example of working in water allocation planning for a regional council. And in one prominent example, we had a whole catchment-wide water allocation process where all permits were being renewed and revisited at the same time. We had irrigators who really wanted certainty about their continued use of water for commercial purposes, but we had local cultural and conservation stakeholders who were really concerned about the impacts that this was going to have on ecological and cultural values of the waterways where the water was sourced from. So we had a process of collaboration which was facilitated by planners to help really draw out from each of those stakeholder groups what their concerns were and how they might be addressed, and ultimately focusing back in on how could the waterway be protected. And we ended up having a really good win-win outcome there where an agreement was made between all of the parties to agree to restore the waterway together through the establishment of a stream enhancement scheme.
Can I ask a supplementary question, Emma, if you don't mind? So can you give us, without being too specific, about examples of a perhaps challenging or perhaps not so successful in the cooperation? And perhaps with hindsight, which is a perfect science, what might you have done differently?
I think if I reflect on some examples of where different decision making hasn't been so successful, there are a few examples that come to mind. One was where there was sewer infrastructure sited on property where the owner hadn't provided agreement to access, meaning that there was a realignment required later on. There was quite a high profile water storage project that was advanced quite far without properly considering that conservation values were going to be affected by the footprint of the dam. Another example I came across recently where a wastewater treatment plant was being advanced before a cultural impact assessment had been properly completed. And in all of those examples, I think the commonality is really pushing ahead with a solution before fully thinking about who or what interests are going to be impacted by that decision, and therefore not properly thinking about how those impacts can be managed appropriately. The impacts of this really can result in more expensive redos, an erosion of trust between important stakeholders, which is very difficult to then get back, and even projects failing to go ahead. So in all cases, there's really some clear and tangible benefits of engaging adequately in planning before pushing ahead with solutions. And I think some of those examples really highlight that.
We come back to the benefits of having a good planner. Thank you so much, Emma.
Thank you.
So I'd like to pose a question now to all of our panelists, and it's a common question. And it really draws a little bit on what we've heard today from all of you, but also what we heard in our opening video from Barwon Water. We know that there's immense benefits in breaking silos and in working together. But we also know that it's quite difficult. In the Barwon Water video, the person spoke about building trust as being very important. But I'd like to hear from all of you panelists as what you think has been critically important in working across sectors, getting people to come together, and how should we actually think of engaging people that don't normally come together? What's been your experience? Christina, could we come to you in terms of your experience about what was important in working across boundaries?
Yes, thank you. I think for me, in the tourism sector and how we can collaborate with the water sector is first understanding that there's, intervening at sector level is probably the most effective way of getting the messages out there to the different sectors. And I say this because water affects everyone. And if you treat all your stakeholders as one group of stakeholders, it'll be very hard to get the message down to the different sectors. Getting that, intervening through, the tourism sector, for example, is through the ministries of tourism and the tourism actors on the ground. We do have, a lot of interventions that focus on communities and totally disregard tourism operations that are within those communities. And so you miss out on what, the impact of those tourism operations on the water sector and the footprint that they have there. So I would see that as a more targeted approach to getting tourism on board. Of course, the responsibility is not just for the water sector, but also for tourism to take into account the importance of water as a resource and include the water sector in your development committees, tourism development committees at the national level or even at industry level. Share that information, the data and the knowledge. And then I think one defining factor that we would like to see help us in the future is to support the planning of tourism through the making available of data and insights into maybe the water sector has the data on how each sector is, the consumption levels of sectors. I think if we can have access to that data, it will be very helpful for our planning and response actions that's needed. And of course, for us as a tourism sector, we need to also involve everyone, including our visitors. We can't be just focusing on ourselves, but also bring on board our visitors who are very important to us because their usage, will contribute to how much our country or our region contributes to water consumption in general. So a lot of collaboration across all groups of stakeholders is what will be very important for us.
Great, thanks. Tristan, can we try to come back to you? Let's see if the system will work.
Thanks, Richard. How's that? Any better?
Much better, great, fantastic, right. Thank you.
Look, I think the key point that I'd like to contribute to this discussion is that I think it's really critical to have a clear and compelling rationale for why people need to be engaged in anything that we're doing. And when people are, feel that they're swimming outside their lane, and often that is a problem, particularly when we're dealing with governments and different government agencies. It's incredibly important to build to ensure that people know exactly why they're sitting around a table. And happily, for water and food are fairly easy topics to build compelling arguments around. So the experiences that we've had right across the region are generally that where a strong and robust argument is put forward for why people need to engage in a project for it to succeed, they're very happy to do so. I think initially, those challenges aren't great. I think in the long term, when programs mature and become perhaps embedded within government, which is ultimately what we'd like to see, I think that's where sometimes there are some road bumps because within government, aligning incentives across sectors can be really challenging. The way we've overcome that in some ways is to focus on transitioning the non-government parts of the economy, particularly the social organisations and the private sector that exist, whether a government comes or goes, and ultimately are most important for service provision in many examples. So economic incentives can also bring people together in a very effective way. yeah, our food cube atoll example, people being able to, I mean, countries where a single lettuce can cost not $10, but $20 or $30, or a cucumber, the ability for households to actually grow leafy vegetables is a really strong driver of interest, and so that's been very useful. And similarly, the challenges that we had initially in Vietnam, convincing farmers to change time-honored practices was really tough, And the first season was we were faced with a great deal of disgruntlement, and the competitors that were working with farmers were really challenged. It wasn't until farmers saw and we were able to demonstrate that they could actually earn more money and could ultimately reduce their workloads that we got really strong engagement in the program. So my 2 points really are around incentives, which we've covered, and secondly, just the importance of a very clear, compelling message. And so, do your thinking is my take-home message.
Thanks so much, Tristan. And that's very, very good advice. Saurabh, you've dealt with some extraordinarily tough cases, right, where the incentives are not obvious, and there's a lot of inertia in systems. Tell us, what's been your secret sauce, the recipe for getting people to work together?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I think I agree with what Tristan said, and foremost, 2 or 3 learnings. Number one, for sure, incentives, and how do you align incentives for sectors as diverse as water and energy. In fact, I remember one of the first experiments of this nexus was conducted under a USAID program called Venexite. The name itself was Water Energy Nexus, and it was basically to ensure that the farmers not only look at conserving energy, but also use drip irrigation and others so that they conserve water. But let me come back as to what we were able to do. I'll start first with the water utilities. Now, water utilities, as I said, the biggest incentive was to number one, reduce your cost, make your operational revenues better, and also deliver a better service to the consumer. And it helped also that when we were doing these things, the government of India at the federal level came out with a massive incentive programs to improve the governance of the municipal bodies. And these parameters were then inbuilt into the program as a reform-linked kind of a drawdown of incentives. So it was a carrot and a stick, where those municipal bodies, and in India, most of the water utilities are actually owned by the municipal bodies. It's only very few that they are independent. So it helped that there was a pot of money that was being devolved from the federal government to the states. And the smart thing that the federal government did was that they introduced parameters, a whole set of parameters, including your governance reforms, your tax collection, and also reduction in operational cost, particularly, and as I said, for water utilities, almost 40 to 50% of cost is largely energy cost. And therefore, it made a lot of sense for these municipal bodies to invest. Now, coming to the farmers, as I mentioned in my previous intervention, that there is ordinarily no incentive for a farmer in a country where there is no tariff for agriculture. So therefore, there was a pilot that was tried, and it's a very interesting pilot that was tried, and I was part of that team in a state called Gujarat, where what was done was that if I'm a farmer, I have my requirement of pumping load is let's say 5 kilowatt. I was allowed by the energy utility to install 10 kilowatt of solar energy in my farm, which means I will use whatever that 5 kilowatt for my own captive consumption, and the next 5 kilowatt I will sell it back to the grid at a fairly reasonable cost that was provided by the utility. It also further said that if you reduce from 5 kilowatt to let's say 3 kilowatt, which you can do by two means. Number one, you can have a more efficient pump, or number two, you can do drip irrigation, where you save on water. I will give you this additional rupees per kilowatt hour. Now that really became a very successful pilot. Almost 1,000 odd farmers joined it. And later on, this has now been enshrined into a national program, which is now attempting almost 1 million pumps replacement on the same model, with a fairly decent 30% capital intensive coming from the government of India and about 30% from the state government. As I said, this has just started, but the fact remains that what I wanted to mention is that if we are able to align the incentives properly of stakeholders, this coming together of seemingly very diverse sectors who have never traditionally worked in the past actually happens, and results are there to show. As I said, these have been initial results, but so far it seems to be heading into the right direction.
Thank you, Saurabh. That is fascinating. I mean, whoever invented that scheme should go and work for Wall Street or a bank, right? It seems so complicated to think about something like that. That's amazing. Emma, could we turn to you now? You really have to deal with diverse groups all the time. So what's the magic? How do you deal with it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's been some great contributions from the panelists. Christina said water is important to everyone, and I absolutely agree. And that's a fundamental thing for thinking about water and including planning and water challenges, is that it's inherently a multi-sectoral challenge. One thing I think is very important is to have representatives from all parts of the water cycle involved in decision making, representing those range of perspectives. And having planners as part of those processes can really help to draw on those skill sets and bring different perspectives together and make sure that those are informing projects and decision making. In doing this, and I think this has been referred to previously, but there is such a lot of benefit in recognising the value of building trust between participants, and that's essential to make sure that people are comfortable offering their perspectives and knowing that they're going to be listened to when they do contribute and they do participate. Make sure everyone is valuing those perspectives and ultimately leading into better outcomes for WASH and for water resource management by bringing those different stakeholders all together. And I think finally, from a practical point of view, there's a real need to have clear planning up front to make sure that decisions are made early about who are the right people to be participating. What protocols are in place to make sure that the people who are participating in planning for WASH and water resource management are able to contribute to decisions, and have processes in place as well to make sure that the outcomes can be adequately evaluated, and that we can also learn from what's gone well and what hasn't gone well. So bringing that all together and using some of those planning frameworks to help inform decisions ultimately and overall.
Thank you so much. Those were invaluable insights, not just for our audience, for whatever little it's worth. Let me try to summarize that, because I think there was so much valuable, useful information there. So one that came out, and we heard that in Barwon Water, was try to build trust. And we hear from Emma as one of the ways to actually build trust is to be open and allow for different perspectives that also require some judgment in who's actually going to be in the room, who you're going to engage. And we heard earlier from Emma that if you don't engage the right people, you forget important things, and that can stymie the whole reform or whatever it is that you're trying to do. So being more open, I suspect, and being more inclusive rather than less is probably the better way to go in the long run. But of course, as an economist, I could not agree more that incentives really, really matter. And we heard about playing with costs, we heard about increasing revenue, increasing your service efficiency, etc. And that probably is really what gets people listening, is the moment you say, I'm going to save you money, or I'm going to make you money, suddenly you're welcome into the room and they're interested. And then, as Tristan reminded us, of course, you need to really do your homework and make a compelling, robust case. So that's almost like a 5-point plan that you've given us. Thank you so much. Let's get to pretty much our last round of very quick questions before we open it up to the floor to actually solicit questions from the floor and from the people that are listening in. Saurabh, the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Richard. So the challenges, as I said, is basically to get people out of inertia, particularly in the agriculture sector. Farmers do not have access to, I mean, they don't need to pay any electricity, and therefore they are reluctant to change. So I told you about one method of creating that demand and creating those incentives. The other thing that we are currently working on, and this is really something which is work in progress, is to do a very innovative kind of a instrument, a power purchase agreement that you normally have with the utility of any developer, solar developer. We are trying to bundle energy efficiency on top of it. And what I mean is, let's say if my power purchase agreement for 25 years with a utility is at 4 cents per kilowatt hour, I will add maybe half a cent on top of it, and do what? I will replace all the pumps of the farmers free of cost. Now, this, what are we doing by this? I remember I mentioned to you the state government and the central government gives 60% capital grant. We're trying to backload this grant over through tariff. So I don't need the capital upfront, but I'm this half a cent per kilowatt hour that runs over on top of that 4 cents of tariff. So what it does is it cleans up the efficiency, it increases the efficiency of farmers. Number two, in these instruments, what we have also provided are 2 more things, and these are very peculiar to India. Normally in India, the farmer's home and the fields have a minimum distance of 1 kilometer or 2 apart. So we are trying to replace the pump with a new one, then allow him to do remote operations of the pump. And it's all very simple with the SIM card these days, where you can use your mobile to put it on, off, so these are the 2 things. The third thing which we are trying to build into this model is the fact that while the farmer doesn't pay for any electricity bill, but he has to pay for maintenance of the pump, because remember, these are very old pumps and they have to be rewound at least once or twice every season. So we're trying to bundle all these things together, a very unique concept where renewable energy and energy efficiency are being put together on the same instrument for a larger good. Yes, it is not easy. I mean, not just I told you about the farmer community, but when you come to the regulators, it's not very easy. It's something very new. It has something which has not been tried and tested. So we had to also convince the regulators at the highest level that yes, there is no harm in trying. There is nothing in the statute that stops me from loading a power purchase agreement with additional features. So we are almost nearly there. This would give a paradigm shift to the way we look at not just this sector, because, and let me spend another minute, Richard, it is not that only the water and energy sectors need to talk together. As we are looking at energy transitions moving forward, your transportation sector, your energy sector, your storage sector, all have to converge, and the way they have been dealt with in silos can no longer really work. So I think it's a paradigm shift that most regulators, policymakers around the world are trying to understand, and we are hoping that we will come out with something small but a very innovative instrument that would make this case of what we call convergence of sectors forward. Thank you.
Very quick question out of curiosity. Do you confront difficulties in explaining these rather complex deals to farmers that are not necessarily, very well educated? Is that a barrier you find?
Yes, yes, it is. Unique. Yes, Richard, it is. So, and therefore, what we did was different kind of communications for different stakeholders. For farmers, simply looking at what is it that they are going to benefit. Maybe 4 bullet points. A, you have a remote operation. That's a big deal for a farmer. Remember, in many parts of India, the electricity to agriculture is given between 10 p.m. in the night and 4 a.m. in the morning. And someone has to wake up, travel a kilometer or 2, switch on the pump, switch off the pump. Whereas this is a big thing where you can do this from the comfort of your home. Number 2 is an actual incentive of making sure that there is a maintenance contract for 5 years so that you don't have to manage. So for these stakeholders, the communication is different. When you go to the policymakers, regulators. Of course, you'll have to argue, you have to make sure that they understand why this is being tried. And this has come out because many things have been tried in the country, but nothing much has succeeded at scale. So you need to keep trying new things.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Fascinating. Tristan, over to you. Hopefully there's no more alarms.
Thanks, Richard. Could you remind me what the question was? It was all a little exciting in there for a while.
Okay, so the question really was about, you're dealing with smallholders and farmers, and it can be difficult to get them to change their behavior, to change their ways and change their practices to improve noble causes like water security. How do you go about doing that? What are some of the challenges and ways you're doing it?
Look, it's a great question. And again, I mean, I think I probably covered a couple of them, but one that really sticks out as being a good example of how to get smallholders to change and get them kind of to share a common vision. I guess is around empowering them. I think the universal experience of smallholder farmers is of disempowerment. They're often the very last people to connect to markets. Those connections are weak. Governments often let them down because they're expensive to deal with. They're often remote and far away. Telecommunications are expensive. Financial services are expensive. So I think what's really important in engaging with smallholder farmers is to be consistent, to be accessible and available, and to provide innovations and benefits that or to ensure that your intervention delivers a direct benefits to them. I think farmers have to see, I mean, they're very, very smart people who manage risk and manage, really complex systems. And so, they won't change unless you can really develop a relationship of trust. So using interlocutors that are known to them, that they have worked with and that they have a good relationship with is absolutely critical. And secondly, interventions need to offer them something tangible. In Kiribati and Tuvalu and elsewhere in the Pacific, where people are faced with the choice of abandoning agriculture or adapting to a new way of growing plants, organising around the island councils to deliver the kinds of training in soil management and maintenance and water management is really, really critical. Similarly, in Africa, the technology that was developed by CSIRO in this particular case, is really a simple technology that farmers love because it gives them something that they didn't have before and immediately allows them to save money and time. And so, those have been really successful because of that. Working with through island councils, trusted delivery mechanisms, trusted relationships, and secondly, making sure that farmers can benefit, and those benefits are fairly direct and immediate. Over.
That's great, and some of those messages resonate very much with what Sarab actually told us, as making it clear what is the case for change. Christina, we won't ask you a question about farmers. Instead, we'll go towards tourism. So how can we achieve resource efficiency in the tourism sector when it comes to water? How can it be realized? I know it's a big question, but if you could just give us a few quick reflections, it would be great.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. I think it's all about partnerships, right from government right down to community level, and not forgetting our visitors. Getting everybody to play their part is very important, including tourism in the water sector agenda. If the tourism sector doesn't feature much on your agenda in terms of those important sectors that you need to work in, I think it's a must, because this is a resource intensive sector. We use water for a lot of things, everything in the hotel or whatever development, water is at the center of everything. So include us in your development plans, but also engage us in the discussions and create an awareness about saving resources and saving water. I think one of the other things too that I really wanted to highlight is the importance of standards within the industry to aspire to. We have some countries in the Pacific who have accommodation standards. Accommodation is the biggest subsector of the industry. And so if we have those standards in place and they target water saving measures, it will be a good platform to push, the message about water efficiency. And of course, engaging across sectors in terms of awareness and the importance of resource management.
Great, thanks. Couldn't agree with you more. Of just the observation that tourism is a very thirsty business and also a very wasteful one. Tourists, it's not necessarily the business that generates so much of the waste. So those norms seem like a very good idea. Emma, can we come to you last, but certainly not least, by any stretch of the imagination? In your experience, what have been the institutional arrangements and norms that have helped to get cooperation, or that might have hindered on the other hand as well? So what's worked in terms of institutional structures and norms, and what hasn't worked?
Thank you, Richard. It's a really good question. And throughout my career, I've seen a range of different arrangements that help collaboration and within water decision making. And one thing that really stands out is that cross-organisational and multidisciplinary collaborations are absolutely essential, and they can work really well when planned effectively with the right people being involved. A couple of examples that are worthwhile touching on. One is in relation to organisational structures. So I worked previously for a local government that established an integrated water team. So we had floodplain engineers, waterway health scientists and ecologists, water policy experts, and water infrastructure decision makers all working together to contribute towards and collaborate towards shared outcomes. And that helped to support the internal collaboration and fostered really substantial progress towards a common vision. So that's one thing that really stands out, where recognising those multidisciplinary inputs and having them actually sitting together and working together on a day-to-day basis really does help drive progress towards shared outcomes. And then there are some other examples of cross-organisational collaborations. One that jumps to mind that I've been involved in somewhat recently is in Southeast Queensland. There are some collaborations between water service providers. So the bulk water providers and the water and sewer providers are really starting to take some initial steps towards integrating planning outcomes across water and sewer for Southeast Queensland. And I think it's a really good example of those initial steps being taken, some agreement being reached about what are the objectives, what are those different organisations trying to individually and collectively achieve, and how can they work together to achieve them in a more effective way, again with that view on what is ultimately the benefit for communities and for the businesses that operate within the city. And then finally, another example that's been operating for a number of years in Southeast Queensland is the Resilient Rivers Initiative, and this is a multi-level of government partnership between water providers, local government, and other catchment stakeholders from a range of different backgrounds, which have been working together to identify high priority projects that will help to improve waterways and water resilience over time. So just a few different examples there of where I think having the commitment over time to working together between organisations and recognising that it needs to start somewhere are all things that are really important. So those are a couple of examples that I've seen where progress has been made and people are working together effectively.
Thank you. It's very heartening actually to hear those good examples. And on that very, very positive note, it gives me great pleasure to hand the floor over to Regina, who will give us some of the questions from the floor. Regina?
Thank you, Richard. Thanks, Richard. And thanks for that really excellent discussion. There's been a few good questions, and I'm hoping Tristan is still with us. But I might turn to you first, Christina. A question from Bronwyn: how ready do you think the tourism sector is to deal with possible water-related hazards like drought, flood, etc., which we know will only increase with climate change? Do you think the tourism sector is reaching out to get data on this and future climate predictions? And perhaps the reverse, is the water sector reaching out to the tourism industry to provide this information to help them to prepare?
First question, I don't think we're ready. Tourism is not ready for the disasters or hazards that are looming. And so there's need for urgent action. In terms of data, I mentioned before that tourism in the Pacific or, throughout the world, that we come across, when we talk about the performance of tourism in any country, it's all about economic returns, how much tourism is contributing to GDP in countries, but we rarely hear, how much we are contributing in terms of the waste that is being generated, how much energy we use and how much water we use, for example. And so that is why we are embarking on the Pacific Sustainable Tourism Indicators Framework. We need to come together and change the way we measure our progress so that we know, in the future whether we are moving in the right direction, whether we are sustainable or not. And that's basically, saying also that there is no data that we are getting. Almost all our reports are about visitor arrivals, the volume of people coming into our countries. Just as long as those rooms are filled and those plane seats are filled, that's success. But we need to change that. And that's why we need to come up with these indicators and get countries to commit to collecting the data, but also reaching out to the water sector to access the data. I don't think we're reaching out, and I don't think there's much effort too from the other side, and this presents a perfect opportunity for collaboration.
Thanks, Christina, that's excellent. Maybe that the economic importance you described of tourism will be a driver for this collaboration, because without that preparation you just talked about, there will be risks to the economic productivity of the tourism sector. So perhaps that will be an incentive in the end to bring people together. Tristan is still with us, I think. I'm going to ask you a question, Tristan, and I think that the text will bring you up on screen momentarily. There's a question from Peter about whether you think agricultural programs are adequately considering water quality for drinking rather than just water for crops. So, for example, excess nitrogen runoff into waterways and groundwater can have a serious effect on the quality of drinking water. So how much does drinking water feature in the programs you've been working on?
Thanks, Regina, and thanks, Peter, for that excellent question. Typically, not enough, I would say. Agriculture, as many of you around the room will know, is the absolutely largest by far user of fresh water. I think others will probably know the exact figure, but it's in the order of 80% of all freshwater use is for agriculture. And that behemoth position really often means that that agriculture doesn't really consider other users. And I think that the issue of nitrogen and other fertilizer runoff is a really, really good one. And if we look at river systems around the world, they are really challenged by this issue. And I think I think all stakeholders around catchment management units and nations really need to come together on this, because this is a multifaceted issue. We use far too much fertilizer. We use it inappropriately. Many countries actually subsidize its use. People don't know how much they're supposed to be using, and they really have no idea what what downstream impacts of that fertilizer use is. So I think there's an enormous need for not just international donor organisations like DFAT, but governments and industry to come together in much more constructive ways. And I think we need, there's obviously potential here for new technologies and for new ways of growing food that don't endanger the dwindling, natural systems that we rely on, and also, the aquifers. I mean, if we take the Pacific as an example, whilst sea level rise and salination of those aquifers is the sort of the most pressing and in a sense sort of existential threat, many of these aquifers have been seriously polluted by overuse of agricultural chemicals and particularly nitrates. So and once they're polluted, it's very, very difficult to get rid of that pollution in closed systems like that. Yeah, in short, no, we have to do a whole lot more. Thanks.
Thank you, Tristan, for that honest and perhaps some sobering response, I think, for us to consider. Maybe following on from that, but I'll ask Saurabh perhaps to respond first. Christina made the comment that her sector, the tourism sector, doesn't really get to join discussions about water very often, and that for her, this is one of the first such discussions. So I wonder, Saurabh and perhaps Tristan also, thinking about the specific on-ground programs you've been involved with in agriculture and energy, how often have you been approached by, the Department of Water Resources or a civil society organisation interested in, community water security? Or is it the case that the programs you've worked in were the initiators of this discussion? In other words, how good do you think we, the water sector, are at reaching out to the other major water users? What do we need to do to improve?
Regina, I think I completely agree with Christiana and others that somehow it's not just the water sector in a developing country like India. I don't think any sector reaches out to anybody else, unfortunately. And therefore, the role of the government and the role of key stakeholders becomes very, very relevant. I gave you examples of how the water energy nexus was, and not just water energy, even the governance was all packaged into a program which was laced with financial incentives, and that's what starts to make the wheels to move at the water utilities level. Part of it is there is not much of an awareness about what can be done, what should be done, whom do we need to reach out to. I don't think the people at the city level, at the water utility level, have that big picture in their mind as to what needs to be done, how what you should do in order to conserve water and energy. And therefore, the role of the central government and the state government and the policy makers assumes a lot of significance. Even for example, multilateral bodies bringing to the fore the need to act now rather than wait for a catastrophe maybe 5 years from now. And so the example of what I was telling you in those 500 cities was not something that the water utilities came to us, but we actually went to them with a package of reforms, a package of financial incentives, a package of providing that expert help which they otherwise don't have. So I think a more proactive approach is needed, particularly in the developing countries, before we come to a situation that people start to look at and find active and good partners to do what needs to be done for the sector.
I would very much agree with what Saurabh has said. I mean, my experience is that the multilaterals and the donors and the civil society are often the drivers of bringing sectors together. They can see the need, they recognise the problem, and in water, as in the atmosphere, there's a degree of tragedy of the commons. In many cases, people don't pay sufficiently or at all for the water that they use, particularly in the agricultural space, so you've got a situation where the systems are regulation is poor, people access is not equitable, and it's a little bit of everyone for themselves. So I think there's really a big need for the water sector to be much more front-footed about approaching the sectors that touch it, and bringing those sectors together for constructive dialogue around better management. I mean, where it comes from, in a sense, doesn't matter. What's important is that we do it.
Excellent, really excellent words to finish on there. Richard, do you want to continue any more discussions? Otherwise, we're probably just about ready to wrap up in terms of time.
I think I shouldn't hold you up, and we can wrap up. But just a couple of sentences from me. Firstly, to thank the panelists profusely. You were outstandingly good in terms of the insights that you provided. I'm sure it's recorded because I think people really should go back and listen to some of those words of wisdom and words of experience that were very practical. And finally, I would like to thank the hosts, but especially to thank Regina for all the effort that you put in to make this a reality. So it's been an honor and a pleasure to be with all of you, and I hope we can meet again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Richard. And thank you to all the panelists for that. You know, it really was an exceptional discussion. We really appreciate the time you've all made to share your experiences and your thoughts with us today. I think that discussion, I think and hope it has inspired us all to create some new collaborations across sectors for our common goals, because I think what is clear is in some of the messages we've just heard is that if we only talk to others in the water sector, we aren't going to get to the point where we have achieved water security for everyone. We really do need to make those connections, and there are lots of sectors and water users who are ready to talk to us. So let's not wait. Okay, now, so don't leave us just yet. We have a couple more interesting and important, but very short discussions and announcements coming up. Firstly, I want to talk about briefly just some highlights. We've had more than 850 different people based in more than 85 countries joining live to the symposium sessions across this week. And another 500 people have registered to access the recordings from another 30 countries. So that's more than 1,300 people across 115 countries. And this tells us there is a real desire to connect with people across water resources and WASH and other sectors and across regions of the world. And we're really pleased that this symposium has helped to make that happen. But it also tells me that a lot of people joined for a session here and there, depending on their interests and their available time, which is totally fine. So to make it easier for you to track down which of the session recordings you might like to watch in coming weeks, we've invited 3 guests to give you a super rapid overview of some of the highlights and messages from the symposium. So first, I'd like to reintroduce Peter O'Connor, who's the Director of Water Security within the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And they are a lead partner on this symposium. So welcome, Peter. Next, I'll welcome Alison Woodruff, who's Principal Water Security Specialist with the Asian Development Bank, also a lead partner of this symposium. And finally, Gabrielle Halcrow, who is a Regional Manager for SNV's Rural Water and WASH programs in Asia. Gabrielle is also one of our most excellent conference committee members. Welcome, Gabrielle. So Peter, first to you, can you share perhaps in just a few minutes, what have been some of the highlights and the key messages that you're taking away from this symposium?
Sure. Thanks very much, Regina. Well, it's a pretty difficult job. The symposium's covered so many areas, and it's done so in such an insightful and authoritative way. So anyway, I've tried to pick out a few. Here's my 6. My first one is the absolutely urgent need to address water scarcity as climate change increasingly impacts our planet. For example, I was really struck in the first session by the words from Kembo Mida, Chief Executive of the Chuck Public Utility Corporation in the Federated States of Micronesia. He described how climate-induced water security is impacting the communities of his tiny small islands nation, how it's also impacting his family, and how it's his family business, but also how it's impacting his own family, and his fears that he and his family may at some point have to leave their home because of climate change and water security. You read a lot about climate migration, but here's a senior public official telling us of the fears that he has that he and his family might become climate refugees. So the urgent need to address water scarcity. The second point that really sticks out for me was that the challenges we face, they're always so interconnected. So to address these challenges, and this came up in a lot of sessions, it means we really need interdisciplinary and cross-sector collaboration. It's essential. But we know that it's hard. We often seem to speak different languages, people from different disciplines. So it's crucial to find that common ground. And I think that common ground is climate change is one, but the other one is that we need to think of why we're doing what we do, and it's about supporting our communities. So that's the key objective that should unite all disciplines. So interdisciplinary and cross-sector collaboration is essential. My third point is simply that water action is climate action. This very simple, very succinct truth comes from Dave Hebblethwaite from the Pacific Community. Water action is climate action. Thank you, Dave. My fourth point is a similar, simple, succinct truth, and it's one that we often say here in DFAT in relation to WASH, and it comes from the Jessie session, and it is that WASH action is gender equality action. At every stage of their lives, girls and women are much more negatively impacted by a lack of WASH services than what boys and men are. Improving access to WASH services for girls and women is one of the most important things that we can do for gender equality. So, fourth message, WASH action is gender equality action. My fifth point also comes from the Jessie session, and it's that an inclusive community is a climate resilient community. It's critically important to ensure that no one is left behind. We need to understand the barriers that women, people with disabilities, and other marginalised groups face. However, we also need to value their capabilities, knowledge, and experience to inform the sorts of solutions that we start working on. So, an inclusive community is a climate resilient community. My final point is that it's important we all support early career professionals. It was really great to see so many young professionals participating in the symposium, and what I noticed is that they were participating confidently and authoritatively. Young professionals may not have decades of experience, but they bring fresh perspectives, eagerness to learn, they're optimistic, and certainly in relation to climate change, they have a high sense of urgency. Oldies like myself need to remember that mentoring should be a two-way process. Experienced staff can and should mentor early professionals, and early career professionals can share back with them different insights and perspectives with with older people like myself. Anyway, so thanks to all the young professionals who participated in the symposium. And so my final point, it's important that we all support early career professionals. Thanks, Regina.
Thanks, Peter. They're really great. Thank you. Really diverse highlights. Alison, let's turn to you for some highlights for you.
Thanks, Regina, and thanks for the opportunity to offer some reflections during this session. I guess, first of all, I just want to offer my congratulations to the organizers and speakers on a successful event. I think ADB has been really pleased to be part of it, and I really enjoyed the sessions that I have had the opportunity to join this week. The presentations and the discussions have been really engaging and brought really interesting and fresh perspectives. And so in reflecting on the key takeaways from the symposium, I think Peter hit on many of those, but it's clear that we as WASH policymakers, practitioners, and researchers, if we do want to build water security and resilience, we can't work in silos. As we heard during the sessions this week on nature-based solutions, on disaster risk management, it's clear that WASH needs to be considered in the context of not just the wider water resources management and thinking about basin level and source to sea approaches, but it also needs to be considered in the context of broader development challenges. So we heard about the links between water resources management and environmental conservation and disaster risk management. And then today we heard really good perspectives on tourism and agriculture and energy and the interlinkages with water, to name a few. I think that one of my favorite quotes from this week's event was the speaker in the opening panel on Monday, who said that we need to unbox and repack sectors together. So get us out of our silos and then put us together to work to find solutions. And I thought that was a really good way of putting it. And this really speaks, to the need on that, those integrated and multi-sectoral approaches, working across sectors, across levels of government, between countries on transboundary water resources management issues, and public and private sector, and then of course bringing in all stakeholders, women, young water professionals, to work together to address challenges. Climate change is of course accelerating the most pressing development challenges by increasing water scarcity and leading to competing demands for water, increasing the intensity and frequency of water related hazards, making these challenges much more difficult to tackle from a single sector. So it's climate change is really the push, I think, as has been said, to work together. But of course, yes, we've heard it's much easier to say than do. As we, government agencies tend to be structured along sector lines, development agencies as well. But I think we have heard this week some really good examples of how we can work together through conscious and sustained efforts by building trust, creating the right incentives. We've also heard what doesn't work, which gives us lessons to learn from. And importantly, I think forums such as this are really important in bringing people together and starting to think about embracing some of these integrated approaches to build water security and resilience. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alison. Really excellent reflections there. Gabrielle, let's hear from you.
Thank you very much. And I think I have a lot of shared reflections with Peter and Alison there. So there are just three things that really stood out for me across all of these sessions. When you have such diversity in participants, I think you said more than 85 countries there of water management and WASH professionals. There is a real diversity experience from the stories about the king tides in Micronesia to the monsoons impacting on life right now in South Asia, and also this disproportionate effect of cyclones that are happening in the Pacific. There was this really resounding call to action and sense of urgency that was coming through. Action on mitigation, on adaptation, and on building resilience. I think in the building equality session, which Peter mentioned, Greta Thunberg was quoted multiple times in terms of we need to act like our house is on fire. And also recognising how the inequity that sits with all of this in terms of the climate injustice and the burden that is not being experienced the same, much as we saw within COVID. The second one, there was this sense of almost the amount of opportunities and synergies between these two sectors was really quite inspiring. The nature-based solutions one was presenting it as win-wins. That this is not the whole solution, but it's certainly part of this story. There was the session on water resource management in terms of water-mediated disasters, talked about the opportunity that water resource management provides for multi-stakeholders and sectors to come together and to work at all of these different levels. And Peter's quote about, in that session it was opening, saying water action is climate action. There was a lot of WASH professionals in that session that were nodding along with it as well. It was this real sense of agreement. Even though it is difficult to work together, it is better when we work together. And this kind of so many different pathways and strategies were being shared. And also in the equality session, that idea that an inclusive community is a more resilient one. So it's not just about water management and WASH professionals, but also working with rights holder groups. And they are a really important actor within this space. And then finally, the voice was really important. The opening session talking about we need to convince the policymakers and the ministries. We need more data and evidence about not just the progress towards the SDG 6, but the impact climate is having now on that. But I would say that it's also that these stories need to be told, they need to be heard. That session with the 28 different stories that we had yesterday, and also all the personal experiences that have been shared for the last 4 days are really important. There was one in the inclusion session again, around really recognising the diversity of the experience in all of this. And a quote from Angelica that basically if we're not including these groups, these vulnerable groups in the decision-making processes, then we're not doing our job. And this is really kind of underpinning all of these actions. But it was a really interesting 4 days and I really enjoyed it. So congratulations as well to the committee and everyone that joined in. And I hope everyone goes away with that sense of urgency and action and ideas for different pathways of working together. So thank you.
Thank you, Gabrielle, and thank you, Alison, Peter, all three of you for sharing your reflections. I really appreciate your time. And just a reminder to everyone else to follow up on the recordings of those sessions that you missed. They will be ready in the next couple of weeks. Now, lastly, just before I hand over to you, Peter, to close the symposium and make a most exciting conference announcement, I would like to give again a huge and heartfelt thanks to the conference committee. I mentioned during the opening that we've had more than 120 speakers across 10 quite diverse sessions, and that's definitely not possible without a really great committee. It's also not possible without really excellent secretariat and organising team. Karen, Isabel, Danny, thanks very much again for helping us deliver what's been a really great event. Fortunately for you, there's no time to rest. We've got a conference to deliver soon. Well, importantly, delivering this free symposium was only possible by the generous support of our lead partners and our sponsors. But they've also been super active committee members, and they've really given huge inputs into planning and spreading the word about the symposium. And so we thank you very gratefully again. I wanted to make a special thanks to the hosts of our Pacific hubs. Thank you, WaterAid, PNG, and the University of the South Pacific in Vanuatu for helping to make it easier for people in your locations to join this symposium. We really appreciate that. And lastly, to the more than 50 people who showed up live to share their stories and join in discussions this week, many getting up well before the sun or staying up long past midnight, your engagement has been truly superb. I don't think I've ever seen such active chat boxes. And with that, Peter, I'm going to hand over you to close the symposium. Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure.
Regina, you have thanked a lot of the people that I was going to thank. So I won't waste further time, but I do have to thank the International Water Centre at Griffith Uni, and in particular you, Regina, who's led the organisation of this event. Congratulations, it's just been such a fantastic event. I also want to thank Karen Deveni and the rest of the team at the International Water Centre, and also to Cara Morgan from my team for all their support and work they did with marketing, logistics, and many other tasks. A couple of others, I'd also like to thank the Water for Women Fund and the Asian Development Bank and the Australian Water Partnership. And again, just echoing your words, Regina, the presenters and contributors, 120, it's been quite extraordinary, quite fantastic. But last but not least, thanks to all the participants for their very active participation. 85 countries from around the world, over 800 people. It's just been great. It's really brought people together around such important issues, and people joining from many different time zones as well. So with that, I will officially close the symposium. But I have one very important announcement that I want to make, and that is that I want to launch the conference call for abstracts and tell you about our in-person conference. So we here at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, we're very excited to be supporting the Water and Wash Futures Conference, which will take place from the 13th to the 18th of February 2023, next year, and it'll be in Brisbane, Australia. The conference tagline is Achieving SDG 6 in a Changing Climate. And it'll build on a lot of the stuff that we've had in this symposium and previous symposiums that we've held under the Water and Wash Futures banner. So this conference in Brisbane next year, that's primarily an in-person conference. And so I really hope that we can see many of you in person here in Australia. Registrations are now open. And we're also calling for conference abstracts. So I'd urge you to go to www.washfutures.com for further details. And I'd also encourage you to share this with your colleagues from your various networks, and hopefully some of the networks you've made in the past week. The details are up there on the screen. So thanks again, everybody, for being involved, and handing back again to you, wonderful Regina. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Peter. We're pleased everyone could join us, and we hope to see you in Brisbane. Thank you.